I was standing by this big, old-fashioned window at Ethan's huge country estate, just staring out at the rolling hills covered in that warm, golden glow you only get in the late afternoon. The house was tucked way back in the woods, like something out of one of those classic movies, huge, full of history, and so quiet it almost felt like time had stopped. It used to be my safe place, you know? Somewhere I could go to get away from all the noise and chaos of the world. But now, standing there with Tyler just a few feet away, it felt different. The silence between us wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like you could cut it with a knife, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't there. Our relationship, which used to feel so easy, was falling apart right in front of me, and I couldn't ignore it. Tyler, like always, was buried in his work, emails, phone calls, you name it. He barely even looked up at me, like I was just another piece of furniture in this giant house instead of his wife. The distance between us kept growing, wider and wider every day, and it felt like there was no way to close it. But then there was Ethan, my father-in-law. He noticed me. Actually, he noticed me a little too much. At first, I thought it was just him being nice, you know? He'd always been the kind of guy who paid attention, who'd go out of his way to make you feel included. He'd invite me on these long walks around the property, sit next to me at dinner, and talk to me like I was the only person in the room. His voice was calm and steady, and it filled up all the empty spaces Tyler left behind. But then I started to notice other things. Little things, like the way his gaze would linger on me a second too long, or how his hand would brush against mine when he handed me a glass of wine. He'd stand just a little too close when we talked, and I could feel this tension, I guess you'd call it. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing I could point to and say, hey, that's not right. But it was there, and I couldn't ignore it. The days started to blur together, and so did my feelings. I'd come here to get away from the mess my marriage had become, but instead, I found myself caught in something even more complicated. Tyler was always working, always distracted. The only sign he was even alive was the sound of his phone ringing. He wasn't just physically absent, he was emotionally gone, too. And that left me wandering around this massive house, feeling more lost than ever. Ethan, though, he was always there. At first, his attention felt like a lifeline, something to hold on to in the middle of all this loneliness. But then it started to change. It felt more intentional, like there was something behind it. A touch that lasted a little too long, a look that felt a little too intense. He'd offer to help me with things I didn't even need help with, just to be near me. It was always subtle, always something I could almost convince myself I was imagining. But I wasn't. Something was shifting between us, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just reading too much into things because I was lonely. But deep down, I knew better. This house, this place that used to feel like a sanctuary, wasn't safe anymore. I'd come here to escape, but instead, I'd walked right into something dangerous. It started small, like a whisper in the back of my mind. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, we were miles away from the noise and stress of our normal lives. But the truth was, it wasn't just the quiet. It was Ethan. I was starting to notice him in a way I never had before. It wasn't just his presence, it was the way he carried himself, the way he smiled, the way his eyes would stay on me just a beat too long when we talked. There was a warmth in his voice when he asked how I was doing, a kind of interest that felt intimate. And every time, I found myself wanting to stay a little longer, to keep the conversation going, to hear him say just one more thing. Something was changing between us, something I couldn't put into words but couldn't deny, either. It was slow, like the tide coming in, quiet but unstoppable. I could feel it happening, even though I knew it shouldn't be. Ethan was becoming a constant in my days, while Tyler was disappearing more and more, locked away in his office, lost in his work. Ethan was the one who noticed me. He'd ask how I was doing, not because he had to, but because he actually cared. He listened, not just to what I said, but to the things I didn't say. His kindness didn't feel forced, but as the days went on, it started to feel different, more personal, more intimate. We'd take these long walks through the woods, where the quiet of nature seemed to soften all the thoughts I was too afraid to say out loud. Sometimes, we'd have dinner on the terrace, just the two of us, with the golden light of dusk wrapping around us like a secret. In those moments, his attention felt like a balm for the loneliness I hadn't even admitted to myself. At first, I tried to fight it. I told myself I shouldn't enjoy his company so much, that it was wrong, like I was betraying Tyler in some way. But the guilt never lasted long. The truth was, Tyler's absence had left this huge hole in my life, and Ethan was filling it. It wasn't just that Tyler was busy, it was that he didn't seem to care about me at all. And then there was Ethan, who always cared. He'd ask how I was doing, not out of obligation, but because he really wanted to know. He listened to the things I didn't say, the pauses between my words. His kindness felt natural, but as time went on, it started to feel more personal, more intimate. We'd walk through the garden in the evenings, the cool air wrapping around us like a secret. Ethan would talk in this slow, unhurried way, like we had all the time in the world. And in those quiet moments, I started to notice the little things, the way he'd glance at me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way his hand would brush against mine, just for a second, leaving this warmth behind. He wasn't overtly flirty or anything like that. If anything, it was the opposite. His attention was subtle, quiet, understated. But every word, every look, carried this weight that it shouldn't have. His presence made the silence in my marriage feel so much louder. It was impossible not to wonder, what if things were different? What if I wasn't here with Tyler, but with him? Ethan never had to say anything outright. Just being near him was enough to stir something inside me, something I wasn't sure I wanted to face. It was a feeling I hadn't had in years, like I mattered, like someone actually saw me. Ethan made me feel that way, and it was starting to change something inside me. It might have seemed innocent on the surface, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I started looking forward to those moments with him, counting down the hours until we'd talk or walk together. Those were the only times I felt alive anymore, like the rest of my day was just going through the motions. One afternoon, when Tyler was off on yet another business trip, I wandered through the house alone. The silence was suffocating, a constant reminder of how empty this place had become. I needed something to distract myself, so I ended up in the old study. The shelves were lined with dusty books, their spines cracked and faded, and there were these old family albums sitting there like they'd been forgotten for years. I'd never bothered to look through them before, but something about them caught my eye that day. I reached for one, the leather cover rough and worn under my fingers. As I flipped through the pages, my hand brushed over photos of a past I had no part in. And then I saw it, a picture that stopped me cold. There she was, a woman who looked almost exactly like me. Same dark hair, same piercing eyes. It was uncanny, like looking at my own reflection in someone else's life. She was standing next to Ethan, younger but unmistakably him. They looked so happy, her arm around his waist, smiling like they shared a secret. The photo was taken before they moved to this house, back when they were just starting their life together. I couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. Who was this woman? And why did I feel this strange connection to her, like she was part of my story too? When I asked Ethan about her later, he seemed caught off guard. "That's Laura," he said after a pause, his voice quiet. "My first wife." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. His expression shifted, like he was remembering something painful. He told me they'd been young, full of dreams, before life pulled them apart. She'd passed away years ago, long before I came into the picture. But even as he spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling there was more to it. The way he talked about her, the way his eyes softened when he said her name, it was like she was still a part of him. And then it hit me, was I just standing in her shadow? Was I becoming her? As the days went on, the tension between Ethan and me grew thicker. I tried to ignore it, but it was always there, just under the surface. His attention had become almost overwhelming. The way he'd compliment me, the way he'd find excuses to be near me. It felt like an invitation, one I wasn't sure I could resist. One evening, Ethan invited me to dinner at a small restaurant in the nearby town. I agreed, mostly because I needed a break from the suffocating atmosphere of the house. Sitting across from him, the candlelight flickering between us, I found myself actually engaged for the first time in what felt like forever. We talked about everything, our childhoods, books we loved, places we traveled. But there was something else there, something unspoken. The way our eyes would meet a little too long, the way his voice dropped when he said my name. It felt like he was confiding in me, like there was something he wanted to say but couldn't. I found myself leaning into it, hanging on his every word. There was this pull between us, something deeper than friendship or kindness. And when he reached across the table and placed his hand on mine, I didn't pull away. His fingers traced the back of my hand, just lightly, but it felt like everything. In that moment, I could feel the walls I'd built around myself start to crumble. All the thoughts I'd been pushing away, about how much I'd come to rely on his attention, how much I needed it, came rushing back. This wasn't just about comfort anymore. It wasn't just about filling the void Tyler had left. It was something more. I'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. When we left the restaurant, his hand found mine again, and for the first time, I didn't question it. I just let myself feel the warmth of his touch. It wasn't until later, lying in bed that night, that I realized what I'd done. I'd crossed a boundary, and now there was no turning back. The memory of that dinner stayed with me, especially the way his hand had felt on mine. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a kind gesture, but deep down, I knew better. The line between gratitude and something deeper had blurred, and I wasn't sure when it had happened. That night, Ethan and I went for another walk in the garden. The sky was dark, the stars scattered like diamonds above us. It was peaceful, but I felt restless. There was this tension between us now, something tangible in the air. I could feel his gaze on me, and I didn't want to look away. His eyes held something I couldn't name but was afraid to acknowledge. We stopped by the stone bench at the edge of the garden, the wind carrying the faint scent of flowers. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, like there was something we both wanted to say but couldn't. "How are you feeling?" Ethan asked softly, his voice low, almost a whisper. The question caught me off guard, but the way he asked it made my heart race. I looked up at him, unsure how to answer. The weight of everything, the guilt, the confusion, the attraction, was starting to overwhelm me. "I don't know," I finally said, my voice barely audible. "I feel so lost." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. His touch sent a shiver down my spine. His face was inches from mine, and I could feel the heat of his breath. His breath was warm against my skin, and I knew I should have pulled away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Before I could even think, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in the softest, most tentative kiss. It was brief, just the faintest press of his lips, but it was enough to unravel everything. The air between us was electric, heavy with longing and questions I didn't know how to answer. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped, like the world was holding its breath. I pulled back, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I had kissed him. I had kissed Ethan. It felt like both a betrayal and a release, and I was too overwhelmed to make sense of it. Ethan didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, his expression impossible to read. But the way he held my gaze made me feel like he understood something I didn't, something I was too scared to admit. I'd crossed a line, and that kiss had made it all too real. "I shouldn't have done that," I whispered, my voice barely audible, like saying it out loud would make it true. Ethan reached for me again, his hand brushing mine gently. "It's not about what you should or shouldn't have done," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's about what's real." In that moment, I realized I couldn't deny what I was feeling anymore. This wasn't just some fleeting crush or a moment of weakness. It was deeper than that, something that was changing everything I thought I knew about myself, my marriage, and the life I was supposed to be living. But I wasn't ready to face it. I wasn't ready to admit what that kiss meant or what would happen next. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to the way things were. My life, as I'd known it, was already falling apart. The morning after the kiss, everything felt different. The weight of what had happened hung over me like a storm cloud I couldn't escape. I avoided Ethan as much as I could, retreating to my room, hoping the distance would help me clear my head. But it didn't. If anything, it made things worse. Every glance, every moment, was tinged with the memory of his touch, his kiss. I could still feel the warmth of his lips on mine, the way my heart had raced. I'd betrayed Tyler. I'd betrayed myself. And I wasn't sure which one hurt more. Then there was the question that wouldn't leave me alone. Why did I do it? Why had I let myself get swept up in the attention of a man who wasn't my husband? The answer was simple but painful, because for the first time in years, I'd felt seen. Truly seen. Ethan had noticed me in a way Tyler hadn't in a long time. He'd filled a void that had been growing inside me, a void I hadn't even fully admitted was there. But that didn't make it right. Ethan didn't push me for an explanation. He seemed to know I needed space. But the way he looked at me, his gaze intense, almost searching, made it clear he wasn't giving up on me. And that only made me feel worse, because deep down, I knew I wasn't ready to let go of him either. It wasn't long before I found myself back in the study, trying to distract myself with the shelves of old books. But as my hand brushed against the spines, I noticed something that stopped me cold: Ethan's phone, sitting on the desk, face up. I wasn't proud of what I did next, but the curiosity and fear were too much to ignore. I picked it up, my heart pounding. The screen was unlocked, and I found myself staring at a series of messages. The first few were harmless, business stuff, plans for meetings. But as I scrolled further, I found something that made my stomach drop. There were texts between Ethan and someone I didn't recognize. The tone was flirty, intimate. One message in particular stood out: I can't wait to see you again. I miss the way you make me feel. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. I'd been so caught up in my own confusion, my own emotions, that I hadn't stopped to think about what Ethan might be doing behind the scenes. I dropped the phone back on the desk, my hands shaking. Betrayal. I'd been a fool, caught up in a fantasy, in the attention of a man who was no different from Tyler. He wasn't offering me something real. He was playing a game, a dangerous, destructive game, and I'd fallen right into it. When Ethan walked into the room, I could barely look at him. His smile was gone, replaced by a tension that mirrored my own. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice low and measured. He knew. He had to know I'd seen the messages. I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice shaking. The words felt like acid in my mouth, but they were out before I could stop them. Ethan froze, his expression faltering for just a moment before he regained control. "Laura," he said quietly. "She's someone I met recently. But you don't need to worry about her." His words hit me like a slap. He was still involved with her. He was still playing both sides, and I'd been just another pawn in his game. A deep, icy pain settled in my chest. Everything I'd felt, everything I'd believed about him, was a lie. It wasn't real. None of it was real. The warmth, the connection, the chemistry, it had all been part of his web. And now I was trapped. I turned away from him, my vision blurring with tears I hadn't realized were falling. I'd let myself be seduced by his attention, only to find out I was no better than Tyler. No better than the man who'd hurt me by abandoning me emotionally. But in that moment, I had one final realization: this was the end. The final, irreversible collapse of the life I'd known. My relationship with Tyler was over. My feelings for Ethan had led me down a path I couldn't retrace. And now, standing in the wreckage of it all, I realized I'd lost everything. There was no fixing this. No undoing what had been done. There was no way back. So I knew I had to leave. But walking away wasn't just about leaving Ethan behind. It wasn't just about turning my back on whatever we'd shared, however fleeting or misguided it had been. It was about something deeper, something more terrifying, leaving behind the person I'd become. A version of myself I no longer recognized. A version I didn't want to be. The decision settled over me like a crushing weight, but I didn't let myself hesitate. I moved quickly, pulling my suitcase from the closet and throwing in whatever I could grab: clothes, shoes, essentials. None of it seemed to matter, but I kept packing, as if the act itself would push me forward, out of this mess, out of this life. The room around me felt heavy with memories. The house, once a symbol of comfort and stability, now felt like a prison, filled with ghosts of choices I wished I'd never made. I took one last look before zipping up my bag. Then my phone buzzed. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. A part of me already knew who it was before I even glanced at the screen. Tyler. His message was short, but it was enough to send a sharp jolt through me. "I know about you and Ethan." A chill ran down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. How? How did he find out? Who had told him? A dozen possibilities flashed through my mind, but before I could process any of them, my phone vibrated again. This time, it was from Ethan. "I'm sorry, but I think we both know what's been happening. You've made your choice. Don't look back." The words stung, not just because of what they meant, but because of the cold finality in them. There was no warmth, no hesitation, just the stark reality of the situation. He was letting me go. Or maybe he'd never truly held on to me in the first place. Maybe I'd been fooling myself all along. All this time, I'd convinced myself I was something more to him, more than just another fleeting distraction. But now, standing there with my suitcase in hand, I felt the weight of that illusion shatter. I swallowed the lump in my throat, blinking back the sting of tears. No more illusions. No more waiting for something that was never real. I took a deep breath, grabbed my suitcase, and stepped out of the room. As I walked down the hallway, I ran my fingers along the walls one last time, remembering all the moments that had once made this house feel like a home. Now, it was just a shell, a place filled with broken dreams and empty promises. When I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a shock. It was bitter, biting, almost painful. But in a strange way, it felt like a wake-up call. A reminder that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of moving forward. I got into the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel weighed down by guilt or regret. My marriage was over. Whatever connection I'd had with Ethan was severed. And yet, as I pulled away from the house, leaving it all behind, I felt something else stir inside me, a flicker of something unfamiliar. A small, fragile sense of freedom. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time, I was ready to face it. Narrator comment. You ever get that feeling like you've been carrying this huge weight for so long, and then suddenly, it's gone? That's where I was. Scared, yeah, but also, free. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Before we say goodbye, if you haven't subscribed yet, I invite you to hit that subscribe button. Your support, even if it feels like a small gesture, means the world to us and keeps us going. Don't forget to give this a like if you enjoyed what we shared today. Every interaction helps us grow and keeps us connected through stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this community.